Mindcrime Liberty Show, with me, Roderick Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss private defence, volunteer militias, and immigration. The topic of defence is very popular and commonly discussed in libertarian anarchist circles. And broadly speaking, there are sort of two different ways that theorists think that defence could be provided by the market, or at least not the state. Whether you want to call it the market or not is another question. Which are broadly sort of like the specialist professional army and the volunteer militia. So the specialist sort of army, this is kind of defended by the traditional ANCAPs. Bob Murphy, I think, is the clearest on this, thinking that you're basically going to have insurance companies providing finance to these effective, like, standing armies who are going to have great technology because they're in Ancapistan, and they're going to provide great defense from any states or anybody else who wants to invade a particular sort of free area. And so effectively, defense is going to be provided by the same means as you provide pizza. That's essentially the model. The other model, probably most clearly articulated by Roderick Long, is that primarily the volunteer militia. He rehearses standard arguments against standing armies, which of course they're a threat to liberty because, well, if they decide to turn on you, well then we can't really do very much about it because they've got a lot more power than you do. They're very well organized, and well, they'll basically threaten you to, well, basically extort money from you and become a de facto state. So Roderick Long says, well, clearly what you need then is the bulk of your military to be provided by a volunteer militia, men of a certain area who agree to fight if need be. Again, the whole of this is kind of conceptualizing in the sense of purely defensive measures. But of course, as Todd Lewis has pointed out, he makes the argument that, private militaries are aggressive and could be expansionist, which I suppose is possible, maybe something we get to. But the whole framework here is one of defense rather than offense. So you've got this volunteer militia, but then the question is, well, how are they going to organize themselves? Surely libertarians and anarchists are going to recognize, at least the sort of ANCAPs of various forms, or market anarchists. The market to some extent. We've got division of labour specialisation. And so what Roderick Long does is he supplements the volunteer militia with a specialised paid force who will maybe have lots of, who'll be specialists, basically mercenaries. Although they might not just be mercenaries as such, they may have some ties. I mean, as to what ties you might want them to have, we could get to. And that'll supplement the main volunteer militia. But the main thing is it's a volunteer militia without conscription, drafts, etc. And so it would be this mostly volunteer militia with some sort of specialised private defence sort of contractors. And that's going to provide the bulk of the defensive forces in the free society. So those are broadly the two camps. Also, I said Roderick Long. David Friedman advocates a similar thing to what Roderick Long does. And David Friedman is interesting because what you tend to find, though isn't exclusively the case, is the more sort of traditional ANCAPs in sort of the Rothbardian and Hoppian tradition would be supportive, like the insurance companies, sort of megacorps provide defense type situation. And more of the left libertarians, the market anarchists, will go to the volunteer militia one, which of course, David Friedman is kind of interesting in that respect, to going more on the volunteer militia side. So those are the two camps. Now, what occurred to me recently was immigration is a relevant factor to this, which I don't think is often discussed. I originally thought about this when I was interviewed on the Warden Post, which has now been taken down by Rick Story, on basically Swithenistan. And it did seem, in retrospect, to think that, well, actually, if you want to defend the free society, and you're going to be defending the society primarily by volunteer militia, then immigration is going to matter, because you don't want people to turn up who have no interest in defending the area and going to free ride on everybody else. Because if that happens to a large enough extent, then the mechanism by which you intend to defend the society will fail. Because you need that sort of group cohesion, people willing to fight for the group. Otherwise, the group could get invaded, and so therefore, defense won't work. Now, the contradiction that I came across is that the left libertarians tend to focus on the volunteer militia, but are almost always open border types who are perfectly happy with absolutely anybody of any race, nationality, creed turning up to live in the country, which seems odd, or at least unthought through, because how would they think they're going to get this ragtag band of people coming together to defend the hypothetical free society? It seems like, well, that's not going to work at all. I mean, free immigration might work with respect to defense if you have like the megacorps providing it, because, well, there's no necessary buy-in required of a citizen in the same way, because it's just mercenaries effectively. It's a paid professional army. You just pay them and they fight. So I did think this an interesting contradiction to discuss with the left libertarians, or just generally the volunteer militia type, and also in general how immigration will work in a free society. I mean, Hopper is famous for being, you could argue to some extent, an immigration restrictionist. But his concept of defense would seem to me to make immigration more viable, whereas the volunteer militia would seem to require great levels of group cohesion. Otherwise, it simply wouldn't work. So I think this aspect of the immigration discussion in the broadly sort of libertarian quarters needs to be discussed further. So, Tim, any thoughts or comments? Do you think I'm right with respect to volunteer militias requiring, meaning that immigration needs to be quite restricted, or at least you need to be very picky on who is allowed in? Or do you think that I'm being too harsh on sort of the left libertarians here?
I think you're mostly correct. The examples of ragtag militias defeating larger centralized armies, like take the Viet Cong for example, you're basically dealing with one main group of people going up against the formerly French and then later Americans, and the same way with like examples like in the Philippines and elsewhere, you have the Philippines kicking out the Spanish and so forth. You have these organized groups. They're generally organized around one national study. Cuba would be another example here. So the sort of multicultural band of people generally don't fall apart, don't generally unify too much. So I would say you're broadly correct. I mean, maybe the American Revolution is somewhat of a difference, but is there really that big of a difference between South Carolinians, New Yorkers, and Virginians? No, not from a 30,000 foot view. So, and to go full Ben Franklin here, there wouldn't be any Catholics involved either. So I do think you're correct in the sense that there is uh, the mass migration is a kind of problem if you want to have a volunteer militia here. And I mean, I think we sort of discussed this a little bit, and I think is that the Roman Empire had a lot of the Gauls and other groups, and I'm not too big on Roman history, so I don't really want to pontificate too much on that topic there too. And as far as immigration itself is, I don't know if you ever watched. I know you did, but the Soho Forum had about two debates on this, and one of the comments made was that mass immigration is very. So I think there'd be less of it if you get rid of a centralized state. So maybe for Roderick Long and others, it's not really a problem because, as critics of it would point out, is that mass immigration only exists because of a centralized state, and the causes of it are oftentimes centralized states. Now you could say, well, we're just trying to create a utopia, and everything will be fine. But like there wouldn't be an agency doing it, and there might be less structural causes of why it's going there too. So that would be my quick comments back to you. I do think you're broadly correct. that maybe maybe there are instances where you have, they kind of societies organized by around by ideas, or societies organized around by a common enemy that could unite. You could unite these differing factions. That could be the case, but that's not just that requires some sort of agreement over at least some amount of things, which may not be possible. So, and it is worth pointing out that both colonialists, as well as like classical factory owners, and the Marxists complain about this, will use, and Todd Lewis likes to bring this up too, will use the differing factions of ethnicities as a ways to divide up their realms. I mean, the British did this, the French did this, the Americans do this. I think the Chinese do this as well in their projects too. They pick one group to put them in charge that the other side doesn't like, or they'll pick a minority to do so. So this kind of like dividing people up is not just done. If you look in other sort of relevant things, so I think you're broadly correct. Although I think I could cut out a few caveats.
Um, so on that basis, that what I still think, even the Roman Empire is interesting. I mean, I'm hardly a history expert. I mean, that was a professional army, and immigration caused that a problem when you have a centralized state, sort of paying wages, etc. It just seems to me to be that the kind of society that would be able to create the cohesion required to get enough buy-in for people to join a volunteer militia is it's going to have to be pretty high. I mean, I think we discussed before, or you discussed when to be Todd Lewis on his old New Zion episodes on his show, and it seems like for New Zion to work, you would need to have everybody who is perfectly happy to go to sort of local meetings and vote on certain males going to vote on certain things that are going to be passed, and everyone's going to need to have like 100% buy-in. It's going to be like effectively congregational church government, whereby there's like constant meetings and everyone's right now. I'm not saying that can't work. It's just that if the free society is going to be dependent on a volunteer militia, then the level of buy-in is going to have to be pretty high. And as you pointed out, you want to be able to rally around something. I mean, it could be ideological, it could be ethnic, but you're going to need something to rally around. And people won't organize and rally around, oh, I get a better job here. Oh, I mean, they might, but it just seems highly unlikely that people go, oh, I'm going to put my life in line to defend this community because I get paid more here than I do somewhere else. Rather, it's going to be a case of, oh, well, can I keep my job and get paid well? Yeah, okay, just need to pay us a little bit of protection money. Yeah, okay, I will. I mean, that seems to be the most likely scenario. So, contrary to what you might think of general sort of open boardedness of libertarians, I actually think if you think about the conditions in which it's going to work, you're going to have to be quite picky over who appears. Now, the defender of open borders might say, well, you are right, but currently the state is so large that immigration over such a wide controlling immigration such a wide area is like just such a too high a level to do it on. It needs to be devolved to like the city level or something like that, or even the borough level within cities or something like that, which ultimately might well be true. But then the question is, well, again, you're then going to get the general strategic question, which is, do you go for sort of accelerationism, or do you try to use the ring of power, as it were, to minimize the costs in the short run whilst trying to aim at something better in the long run? I suppose that might be the argument of that. But Tim, John, just as a general point, which camp would you put yourself more in? Would you put yourself in the sort of Bob Murphy sort of megacorps provide defense for free society type thing, or would you think that it'd be more likely that if a free society is possible, that you would need a large volunteer militia to make it work?
I'm not sure. I haven't thought about these two camps divided up very long. I would say that I'd say the primary pro of the volunteer militia is it's not, the classical case against standing armies, which I think is very boring, very elementary. I do think the volunteer militia poses problems if indeed it is specialized, and this goes back to like the archery thing example that David Friedman and Todd Lewis have discussed. Like you need to sort of train yourself. Do people have the incentives to be an actual fighting force here? So I mean that's multiplied, of course, by bringing others. I will point out though that there might be structural forces in the United States that no longer exist that did exist, the assimilationist force, but Germans who just immigrated off the boat to the United States, in general, were quite willing to fight the Germans in World War One, World War Two, as all sorts of things, spies, translators. So there is, and I think like the even like the Indians, the whatever indigenous groups you want to say, they were also useful in the Pacific War too. So there is some precedent of other groups. Now you could say, well, the Germans that came here hated Germany, so maybe they're the ones that same way with Russians that came here, they're the ones that particularly hate the regime they left. So maybe that'd be a case for Roderick Long. There are certain types of immigrant groups, and in the back of my mind, I always think there is an optimistic case. I don't want to sound like some milquetoast loser. I'm well aware there could be some issues here, but I do think there is an optimistic case on certain types, and culture sometimes complains about this, but I think generally immigration is positively selected in the sense that it's only ambitious type. Someone was saying that I was working with somebody and they say all the Nigerians I know are very smart, and I quickly responded, well, that's probably largely selection effects because only the people who come, or maybe Haitians, they said. Well, I was like, well, that's probably somewhat selection effects because a lot of the people that stayed behind wouldn't have the ambitious will to, move away 1,000 or 5,000 miles and get a visa and all these other jump through all these hoops. So I do think there is a selection effect. So maybe on second hand, Roderick Long is correct. Although I would say currently today, immigration, contrary to what the open borders people think, is a status thing. It would look very much different. And it also depends on the scale of the society too. I think scaling problems matter. But as far as that, I would put myself into the volunteer militia group, simply out of I don't I do find some of the arguments against privatization of defense to be mercenary in nature. Although I could easily be talked in or out of it, I do think there are benefits to paying for things. Like if you have a problem, do you want to pay a quote unquote expert to fix it, or do you want to try to fix it yourself? I mean, if you can think of it that way, like David Friedman would talk about this with cars, and Bob Murphy would talk about this with cars and stuff, or whatever, for refrigerators. It's better to have someone who spends all his time working on refrigerators and plumbers. Now, of course, you might come back, Kevin Carts and others might come back. Well, that's just because there's licensing and other things that make this artificially restrict the market. And, you can't actually, or IP or whatever, that artificially restricts the market. But I do think if you do something a lot, you're better at it, even if you get rid of licensing and other things. So with respect to defense, I do think there's a case to be made for quote unquote experts. And that I think is a problem. Even if there is group cohesiveness, I do think that is a problem for military affairs. And I think this was also a problem even before advanced weaponry was a problem. In a way, it was actually more of a problem Because I think learning how to use a phalanx or whatever the exact weapons the Romans used actually might have been more physically difficult than it is to learn how to use an AK-47 or something like that. So and this also depends on what type of conflict you're fighting. I'm going to go back to one of my pet examples I like to use. For example, one reason that the Saudis do it, but also Israel does it. So one of the reasons that they have like well developed airlines is that it's very easy for them to train fighter pilots. So if you think a navy, or you think having an air force is a thing, just have an airline industry. I don't think having a private airline industry is an a priori or an empirical problem for libertarians like it. So if you need to have fighter pilots and things like that, you could just have a naval, an airline industry here that would be activated. I mean, again, it would be voluntary, but you'd have some basic skills to be used if necessary. So I do think relevant industry crossover would be useful here, and that's also helped the Americans out. Like one of the reasons there was a paper that said, why did the Americans win the Pacific War? Well, they just had more small engine mechanics than the Japanese did, because they knew how to fix. Because if you know how to fix cars, you can also know how to fix P-51 Mustang engines better. So you have relevant skills and support and logistics. So it depends on what type of conflict you have. But as far as to solve the expert problem, I think it would be solved. You have a diversified uh, economic industries of mechanics. If you're fighting an industrial war, if you're fighting a war of if you're fighting like a hand to hand like fighting war in like the streets, then it just seems like it is just a conflict of wills and attrition in that sense. So it depends on the conflict. But I would actually put myself in. I think given enough time, I think a volunteer militia could, with an advanced economic sector, could come up to there. So those would be some of my pushbacks to the sense there. So then,
I think the specialization point is a very good one. I think that's why the David Friedman and Roderick Long try to mix in the professionals and the volunteer militia. And so the question is, what's the mix going to be? I think mostly it's likely to be the volunteer militia with a decent amount of professionals. But as you point out, depending exactly what they need to do. I mean, there is a lot of crossover. I mean, if you're making vehicles or whatever, can you switch over and produce tanks? I think I discussed this actually. Again, I mentioned before Todd Lewis on private defense. And it was quite a good episode, and we discussed various practicalities of it. I think really when it comes to the volunteer militia, I think the question is, I raised this in the beginning, is what will people typically fight for? And it seems to me that people typically fight for like a people group, their ethnic group, or their sort of town, or their area, and they will fight for sort of religious causes. And I suppose I also had the ideological ones as well, which to a large extent function as religions. Those seem to be the things that people typically fight. And by fight, I mean in like a war situation. Clearly, people will kill people for money or whatever, but that's not to get be boots on the ground. That's not really what motivates people to fight, especially if they're not being paid to do so. And so, whilst it's true there's selection effects, and you are right, I think it's true if you look at the immigration numbers and things, the Nigerians are more than the whites in America. Well, that's because only the clever Nigerians have turned up. The question is, are they of the profile that would fight for America? To which, well, I don't think so, probably. I don't know what it's like, but I imagine the second generation of upper middle class immigrant blacks is, I don't think, a major source of the U.S. military intake.
Not to be annoying, but as Max Blumenthal reports, I think in Los Angeles, for example, I believe that they have the highest per capita. Max Blumenthal reports this as a fast fact that Hispanic Americans have some of the highest Middle Eastern War veteran rates. So there is some. I mean, there is a sort of sinister narrative here, which is they support immigration just so they have desperate people to join the U.S. military, because the U.S. military, like most militaries, have a recruiting problem. So I do think there are The military is generally in a wealthy society. Military is generally like it's only the poor people who really want to join and live in a sub or go die in a desert. So I will say that there might desperate people might be a good recruiting tactic. But then again, how loyal are these in actual conflicts? Which goes back to your first point, which I'm largely in agreement here. And in a sense, they can pay them. So if so I do. I'm not trying to sort of totally desubtract from your point, but that's just a quick comment, not to be
No.
annoying.
That makes entire sense. But as you later pointed out, that's perfectly reasonable in the case of like basically mercenaries. And I mean, really, I mean, if you fight for the U.S. military, you're basically a mercenary. You get paid on a professional soldier. Like you've been paid to fight, basically. And yeah, you're right. Typically, it's the working class who will join up. And so, basically, lots of poor Hispanics turn over and work in California. So we'll work for the Defense Department. So the question is, if you didn't pay them, would they fight? And so, maybe not. An interesting one you were saying about how if you do things more often, the better you are. I suppose you could always argue that if you really wanted the best military fighting force, you constantly need to be in conflict. So you always have battle hardened troops, which of course few people really are going to want to defend unless you want to defend empire, which of course you could. So the I think the more and more I think about it, if a free society is possible, it's not just going to be the case that it's going to have immigration restrictions in some way. I mean, it might be able to be done by covenants. This is kind of the Hoppian position, really. I suppose I'm becoming more sympathetic to, or even just like whoever is the de facto leaders of the society say, well, look, you can't bring these time people in, and people just follow what they say. I mean, there's various different ways of doing it, but you're going to have to be pretty stringent on the types of people, and if, to quote unquote, they're not sending their best, you probably don't want them. So that's one aspect. Although, I mean, related to this, then the question is, well, if you do need this level of group cohesion, the question is, well, would such a society be desirable? Because this is the argument that Right Ruminations makes in defense of the state, is because you need this sort of bigger entity over these smaller areas to be sort of like this, giving you rational governance, and also, as it were, to liberate the individual from his clan or his religious group to some extent, and so then can preserve freedom of speech. There was another guy who basically made this same point, John Berry or something. There's a guy from the early 20th century who did a book called The History of Free Speech, who was very much in favor of like the centralized sort of rational state, because this is where freedom flourished rather than these small sort of despotisms in various different places. So I suppose the question is, so it's John Berry, The History of Freedom of Thought. That's the book I was thinking of, and that was originally written in 1913. So I suppose then the question is, if it is the case that a free society would require such levels of group cohesion, the question is, would that society be a desirable one? Would that be a place you'd want to live, or is it going to be very much dependent on the type of society, or which group you are a part of, as it were? What do you think, Tim?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. If a free society required such group cohesion, so much so that you could argue that it couldn't really be that individualist, because otherwise it couldn't organize, would this be a desirable place to live?
Depends on what you think is desirable, I guess. There is benefits of alienation, I do think, contrary to what Kevin Carson, the Marxists. Actually, the Marxists are actually more interesting on the alienation. They're sort of ambivalent about it. Now there is benefits of being in a more alienated um uh uh setting in that sense. So I mean I think is more dependent on what you think is a desirable society here. Uh, I do think there's a benefit of not being occupied. Uh, um, One of the things the Marxists, like the hardcore Marxists, not the American or British or French ones, although a few of them will do, is they'll just say that the working classes in the United States are too fat and lazy and too paid off basically to be any remotely revolutionary, and they're just basically Joe Biden supporters at best, at, or whatever. And I think that's basically correct, which is one of the reasons why I'm not a Marxist, by the way. Um, so I do think there is it. I think Ancapistan, to go full Rene Girard would have to have a reasonable enemy to begin with, to motivate the militia. So I do think that Ancapistan, if it's a small city state or it's like maybe a middle sized state, it would have to not have if if it's going to need a militia, it's going to need an enemy to rally around, in that sense. So it's not going to be a an empire. Maybe they'll have commercial interests elsewhere. Okay, that'll be the case. But if it's just commercial interests, that can be solved with mercenaries. You're not attacking the central metropolitan area here. You're attacking the outlying, maybe an outlying trading post or something like that. So if certain corporations within Ancapistan develop some sort of trading interest far away, those trading interests are threatened. That would be their problem. It wouldn't be. It would be it would be Boeing's problem, or it would be or whatever corporation said there. That's not really issue. It's not threatening the quote unquote mainland here. So if it is threatening the mainland, I do think there would be some interest in rallying around and defending it, but I would hope it wouldn't get to that situation. Although it could, although it could. I reckon. I mean, I think, in some sense, diplomacy would also have to be useful here, as well. So would it be a desirable society to live in if it's with that level of a group cohesion that is necessary? Um, I think there would be, if it was actually being attacked. I think the group cohesion could be ramped up, and if it's not being attacked, the group cohesion could be wound down, so to speak. I mean, you sort of get this with you sort of get this with there's certain groups that complain that after in the 50s and the 60s we were complaining that this generation hasn't fought a war, which is one of the reasons why some people wanted Vietnam in the United States. They wanted that generation to go through the sort of go off abroad and kill some group, in defense of the United States, because he did it in the 1910s, he did it in the 40s, and now the 60s again. So I don't know. The tight knit. I mean, there's a lot of interesting sub alternate, like, things at play here, because the military does have a effect of it being a progressive force on society, in the sense that it did arguably assimilate the. I mean, this is where the left libertarians have a lot of problems, because like the U.S. military was always like the U.S. military was one of the first institutions that was desegregated in the United States, and it was done for arguably, and again, a lot of people would point out, it was done for arguably, uh, quote unquote, bad reasons, because they wanted to send them over to Vietnam. Um, Now, again, you could go turn around and say that was you could just, but I know American history better than I know, obviously, other history, because for one thing I live here, but also because it's the main power today. Um, so I do think, if it depends on ANCAP stands position in the world, what enemies it's fighting, and so forth. But as far as a question, if you're really being attacked, I would be the cohesiveness would be useful. But I think you might be confusing cause and effect here. If there is an enemy, then it would create the community necessary to keep the enemy out. That'd be my position here. And you sort of see this with Marxist struggles when they happen, like you get in Cuba, like in Spain, with the nationalists in Spain, and Cuba, as well as Vietnam. It would create the tight knit communities necessary, to but you're not going to do this on false flags, necessarily. That'd be That'd be my point. That would be, or trading interest. That would be more mercenary. But that's not really an issue. That would be dissolved by the elite corporations, mercenaries.
Yeah, I think you make a good distinction between the commercial fighting and the homeland, and that's exactly the case. I mean, this would be sort of like part of Kevin Carson's argument as to why international trade might not be quite as extensive, because they'd have to pay for their own defence. But again, if they've no tax, it might well be cheaper overall, so they could have more. But I mean, it would at least give a relative advantage to more local production and interest than there is today. So I think you make a good point there, and also that there is more group cohesion in a ramping up to wartime and whatever. Although, to the extent that in peacetime is too much and it becomes uncohesive, then you're probably more likely to be invaded. Everything else being equal, of course. I suppose what I would say it really is, it's going to depend on which society and what type you're there. It is, but I would say that your traditional sort of left libertarian, who tends to be sort of, not all, he might be an unfair characterization, but many tend to be sort of like sort of libertine, individualist types. And I think that they're unlikely to enjoy living in such a society. So I think there is a sort of a contradiction between their sort of desired lifestyle and their desired political situation, political arrangement. I mean, really, I would say if you want to live the lifestyle that the left libertarian wants to live, you basically Ben Burgess and you're just a welfare state capitalist with UBI. I mean, that's really what allows you to kind of do what you want in that sense. Otherwise, there's too many sort of feedback loops which prevent that from happening. And one obvious one here would be sort of defence issues. And I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you like this, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.